Tensions in the Middle East are rising again. The world is watching Iran and Israel. Airstrikes, escalating conflict, geopolitical chaos, and every time risk spikes in this region, global energy markets focus on one place, a 21-mile bottleneck that carries 20 million barrels of oil a day, the Strait of Hormuz. The Strait of Hormuz is one of the most critical choke points in the global energy supply chain. It connects the Persian Gulf to the Gulf of Oman. 30% of the world's seaborne oil passes through this strait. 1/3 of global liquefied natural gas, LNG, flows through here. Located between Oman and Iran, the Strait of Hormuz is deep enough and wide enough to handle the world's largest oil tankers. It is one of the most important oil bottlenecks on the planet. Massive volumes of oil move through this narrow passage every single day, and if the strait closes, there are very few alternatives to move that oil out. In 2024, an average of 20 million barrels per day of oil passed through the strait. That's roughly 20% of global petroleum liquid fuel consumption. In the first quarter of 2025, oil flows through Hormuz remained relatively stable compared to 2024. Even after recent regional tensions, there have been no blockages of maritime traffic through the strait. But on June 12th, Brent crude was trading at $69 per barrel. By June 13th, it had jumped to $74. No blockage, just fear. This highlights the critical importance of the strait to global oil supply. Choke points are narrow passages located along widely used maritime routes. They play a crucial role in global energy security. Even a temporary disruption in oil movement through a major choke point can cause significant supply delays, transportation cost increases, and surging global energy prices. Most choke points can be bypassed using alternative routes, but some have no practical alternatives. Most of the volume passing through Hormuz has no other way out of the region. However, there are some pipeline alternatives that can bypass the Strait of Hormuz. Between 2022 and 2024, crude oil and condensate flows through Hormuz decreased by 1.6 million barrels per day. This was only partially offset by a 500,000 barrel per day increase in refined petroleum product shipments. The reduction in oil transport through the strait partly reflects OPEC+ voluntary production cuts implemented multiple times since November 2022. These cuts reduced exports from Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, and the UAE. Additionally, in 2024, disruptions to oil flows near the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, which connects the Arabian Sea to the Red Sea, forced Saudi Aramco to shift seaborne crude transport away from Hormuz. Instead, they used the East-West pipeline to move oil overland to Red Sea coastal ports. Also, as Persian Gulf nations expanded their refining capacity, regional crude demand increased. Some volumes shifted to local markets within the Persian Gulf itself. In 2024 and Q1 2025, the volume passing through Hormuz accounted for more than a quarter of global seaborne oil trade and roughly 1/5 of global oil and petroleum product consumption. In 2024, about 1/5 of global LNG trade, primarily from Qatar, also passed through the Strait of Hormuz. According to tanker tracking data published by Vortexa, Saudi Arabia moves more crude oil and condensate through the Strait of Hormuz than any other country. In 2024, Saudi crude and condensate exports accounted for 38% of total Hormuz crude flows, 5.5 million barrels per day. Saudi Arabia and the UAE have some infrastructure that can bypass the Strait of Hormuz. This can mitigate disruptions to transport through the strait to some extent. These pipelines are typically not operated at maximum capacity. In the event of a supply disruption, it's estimated that about 2.6 million barrels per day of bypass capacity could be made available from Saudi and UAE pipelines. Saudi Aramco operates the East-West crude pipeline with a capacity of 5 million barrels per day. It connects the Abqaiq oil processing center near the Persian Gulf to the Yanbu port on the Red Sea. In 2019, Aramco temporarily expanded pipeline capacity to 7 million barrels per day by converting some natural gas liquid pipelines for crude transport. In 2024, Saudi Arabia increased crude transport through the East-West pipeline to avoid maritime disruptions near Bab el-Mandeb. The UAE also operates a pipeline that bypasses the Strait of Hormuz. This 1.8 million barrel per day pipeline connects onshore oil fields to the Fujairah export terminal on the Gulf of Oman. In 2024, crude and condensate volumes from the UAE passing through Hormuz decreased by 400,000 barrels per day compared to 2022. This was due to refinery upgrades that enabled more heavy crude to be refined domestically. These upgrades also allowed the UAE to increase exports of lighter crude grades and increased use of the pipeline to the Fujairah export terminal. As pipeline use has increased in routine operations, spare capacity to reroute additional volumes to bypass the Strait of Hormuz has become limited. Iran opened the Ghor-e-Jask pipeline, bypassing the Strait of Hormuz, and the Jask export terminal on the Gulf of Oman in July 2021 with a single export cargo. The actual capacity of the pipeline is approximately 300,000 barrels per day. However, during the summer of 2024, Iran exported less than 70,000 barrels per day from the Bandar-e-Jask and Khu Mubarak ports using the Ghor-e-Jask pipeline. After September 2024, cargo shipments stopped entirely. As of March 2026, Iran's Supreme Leader Khamenei was killed in a U.S. Israel airstrike. Fighting between the two sides has intensified. As the war between Iran and the U.S. Israel escalates, the crisis of a potential blockade of the Strait of Hormuz, which accounts for roughly 20% of the world's seaborne oil transport, is also escalating. Iran has attacked US and UK tankers near the Strait of Hormuz. If this leads to an actual blockade of the strait, forecasts suggest international oil prices could reach $100 per barrel. Rising oil prices would fuel inflation and could shake the global economy once again. The Strait of Hormuz is 21 miles wide at its narrowest point. 20 million barrels per day pass through, 1/5 of the world's oil, 1/3 of its natural gas, and it sits between two nations on the brink of war. Saudi Arabia and the UAE have pipelines, limited capacity, already in use. If Hormuz closes, those pipelines can reroute maybe 2.6 million barrels per day. That still leaves 17 million barrels per day with nowhere to go. No ships, no oil, no alternatives. Brent crude jumped $5 in one day on fear alone. Imagine what happens when the ships actually stop. $100 oil isn't a prediction, it's a baseline. And $100 oil means inflation roars back. Central banks that just started cutting rates, they'll have to reverse course. The global economy that's barely recovering, it stalls. Supply chains that rely on cheap energy, they collapse. This isn't a regional conflict anymore. It's a global energy crisis waiting to happen. And the trigger is a 21-mile wide stretch of water that one nation can close at will. If you want to understand how a single choke point can hold the entire global economy hostage, not through theory, but through the barrels per day, the pipeline capacity, and the geopolitical reality that makes alternatives useless, subscribe to Endgame Economics. Because by the time oil hits $100, the inflation spike will already be priced in. Stay aware, stay prepared, stay ready.